Hey y'all, happy kind of belated Valentine's Day. I might have missed Valentine's Day with this tutorial, but you know, the sentiment of showing people that you love, whether they're romantic or family or platonic, that can be something we bring into our lives every day of the year. So I started this off with a penciled blue line sketch. So I printed this out using my printer, using my blue line method, which I've talked about here on the channel before. And then I used the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pins in various colors to do a colored line art. And basically you're gonna pick your local color. So roses are red, something like that. Now, when it comes to skin tones, I like using fun, vibrant colors to ink skin tones. You can kind of go with whatever you like. In this instance, because she's going to have a darker skin tone, I'm using purple. I think it's a nice accent that doesn't desaturate the piece too much. When I'm rendering lighter skin people, sometimes I'll use pink, sometimes I'll use purple. It really just kind of depends on what mood I'm in and the mood of the piece itself. And I just want to point out that if you want to color along with me, my amazing art nerds on Patreon, patreon.com/natosoup, receive this line art for free. So if you're a patron, feel free to print it out, color it up, and tag me. I want to see your beautiful art. If you're not a patron, it's not too late to join and you'll still get this amazing line art. So this video has been time-lapsed to varying degrees at varying points. I did it 2x, and then in VN I did it anywhere from 4x to 8x. So I just want to point out that it has been greatly time-lapsed. But to ink this piece, it took a couple of hours, and I was kind of taking my time watching YouTube videos, just kind of chilling out. And I did it in 2 different sessions, with the roses taking up a lot of the inking time. And then for the main piece, I want to say it took about 6 hours. I did it over the span of an evening and the next morning. So art takes time. Feel free to be patient, take your time, and be patient with yourself. I also want to point out that this started out as a super duper rough traditional media sketch in my sketchbook, just to get the placement, just to get the concept. I scanned that, and then I went ahead and I sketched and tightened it up in Photoshop. You don't have to use Photoshop. Photoshop's just what I'm familiar with. And I shared the process over on my Twitter, natosoup. In case you guys aren't following me on there, I recommend you check it out. And basically it was mostly just tightening things up, refining things. And one of the reasons I like doing a lot of my sketching, once I have the initial concept kind of doodled out, but why I like sketching digitally is it gives me a chance to flip things, it gives me a chance to resize things or rotate things, or I can do things on multiple layers and kind of move them around, and it just gives me a lot of flexibility. So even though a lot of what you see here on the channel is traditional art, a lot of my art process is done digitally, and I just kind of want to destigmatize using digital when you need to use digital and using traditional when you need to use traditional. A lot of artists use a mix of both. I also want to go ahead and talk to you guys about the colors I'm going to be using for this illustration. Now, unless I'm making a tutorial because I'm teaching a class on a particular brand, I use whatever alcohol markers strike my fancy, and I typically prefer foam rubber brush nibbed alcohol markers. So you're going to see a lot of those in today's tutorial. I'm mostly using Copic, both Copic Sketch and Copic Chow, Prismacolor, and Blick Studio Brush markers. So I'm not really brand specific. So for her dress, the colors I'm using are, and these are Prismacolor colors so far, PB 208, 006, and PB 280, with 006 being a Blick Studio brush color. I also introduced in some PB 52 and RV 63, and I ended up swatching more colors than I used because that's how you figure out what colors you want to use. And I'm working with a limited color palette for this piece just so that it doesn't become too overwhelming. So for her skin, I'm using PB 95, PB 65, PB 213, with a little bit of Copic E49. Now her hair is kind of a mix of different colors with PB 208 and 006, but also PB52, PB53, PB128, and PB51. You guys will see that in a little bit. For the hearts on her dress, I went with PB128 and PB51. For her glasses, I went with PB208, 006, PB280, and then for the shadow, PB56. For the blue of her eyes, I used B00, and then, I apologize, I didn't write this one down, one of the really, really light Prismacolors. I believe it is cerulean blue, so it's a really light, warm blue. For her eyes, which are mostly covered up by her glasses, and I didn't want to render them too much, I used BG34, BG13, and BG03, so those are 3 Copic colors. For the reds in this illustration, I used PB151, PB150, and for the shadow on her skin, to start her skin out, I used V06, which is a red violet, as well as Blick 011. And then for my darkest reds and to shade some of my browns, I used V99. So the technique you guys see me using here is I'm doing a colored line art technique, but I'm not just doing the local color, I'm doing the local color plus the shadow. So for example, with the reds, we would have red and then the shadow would be inked with purple. For the greens, we'd have green and then the shadow would be inked with blue. Tombow has introduced a few new colors. Some of the neons are really useful for like inking the lightest version of that color. So for her dress, the base color is neon pink. And then for shadows, I inked it with regular pink. And for the whites, like white lace on the bottom of her dress, I use neon blue because it's so light. It basically reads as a very light blue. And I really like inking with brush pens because they offer not only a lot of flexibility, but they also offer a huge variety in line weight. And I highly recommend, if you haven't tried inking with brush pens, to give them a try. I really do like the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens. That's the ones I'm showing you here. They have a slightly stiffer brush on them, so if you're heavy-handed and you generally struggle with brush pens, you might like these because they're not going to be so prone to getting floppy, and they're not going to be so difficult to use. But you can still get a wide variety of line weights, and now some of mine are starting to die out, but I've used them to ink dozens of pieces, so you can really get a lot of life out of these. I believe you can find them at Michael's now at a bit of a markup. I used to buy them open stock at Plaza in Nashville, Tennessee. Don't have a Plaza where I live, and they don't yet sell them at David's Art Center. So I get them either through Blick or through Amazon. And I'll put links down in the description below, as well as a list of all the materials and all the colors that I used. Unfortunately, this video doesn't have a transcript. I'm kind of narrating live. It's one of the few that doesn't have a transcript, but it should have captions on it, so hopefully that makes following along a little bit easier. I also have loads of alcohol marker tutorials here on the channel. If you're interested in learning more about markers, if you're new to markers, I've got you covered. I'll drop links to those playlists in the cards as well as in the description below. So for her hair, I wanted it, or initially I wanted it to be pink to black ombre, but I thought the black might be a little bit harder for me to blend. So what I ended up doing was I went very light pink to dark purple instead. And you can kind of see that reflected in how I'm inking this with, we start with the neon pink, then we go to the regular pink, and then at the very bottom, I use a little bit of purple. Something else about this is, or inking like this, is after you finish coloring the piece, you can always go over it and re-ink certain areas if you kind of guessed what color you were going to use and you ended up changing your mind midway. So you're not completely tied to these colors. These are just a suggestion, but it can make selecting your colors easier. In addition to smaller how to use alcohol marker tutorials, I also share alcohol marker reviews here on the channel to help you guys find the best bang for your buck. None of these reviews are, or none of the reviews in 2001 and 2002 were sponsored. I always disclose when a product has been sent to me to review, and I do always try to review these products to the best of my ability, comparing them to other alcohol markers, usually Copic, because people have experience with Copic on the market. So I try to be as fair as possible, and I always do both an unbox and swatch, which are kind of my initial thoughts, and then a field test where I actually try to render an illustration using those markers. So if you're on the market for alcohol markers, hopefully I've got some great answers for you, and you're always welcome to reach out to me either on my community tab or in my Discord server, the Paint Box, and ask me questions. I'm more than happy to help. And I do try to review markers from around the world. I don't always have access to everything. And I try to review stuff all the way from Dollar Tree and Five Below to Copic and sketch markers and Prismacolor markers. So hopefully I've got something to fit any budget. I also seasonally record longer alcohol marker tutorials like this one. I've got a couple from Christmas and from December. I also have some from October, and I plan on continuing this because it actually gives me the opportunity to create a variety of illustrations and to depict a variety of things. Although people who watch my stuff know I'm very fond of cute girls, and I'm very fond of 80s anime aesthetics, so generally my work kind of leans toward that. But I'll pop some of my favorite of those tutorials in the description below if you want to follow along, and those generally come with a line art. Again, my amazing Patreons get those for free, but you can buy them on Gumroad if you want to. So for the chocolates in the background, I'm basically just using black and brown to ink these, with the black designating darker chocolate. Now, for the ones that have like sprinkles or nonpareils on them, the little round balls, I am using different colors to ink those because I want them to be cute and colorful. These are Valentine's chocolates, which I didn't get any Valentine's chocolates this year, but I guess that's all right. Maybe next year. But I'm trying to really capture a fun, cute moment. I'm not trying to say who these flowers are from or who these chocolates are from. I'm just trying to capture a warm, fuzzy moment during a year where people need more warm, fuzzy moments. So after I finish inking this line art, I allow it to cure. I allow it to dry for 24 hours. Then I use a white vinyl eraser to erase all the pencil lines underneath. I scanned it and shared the line art with my patrons, as I mentioned, and now it's time to color. But first, we're going to do some swatching, and I'm using the same paper that I'm coloring on for my swatches. This allows for best color accuracy, and it's going to tell me how these colors are going to look on the paper. And I keep them in order so I can label them, and that's how I'm able to tell you guys what colors I actually use in the tutorial and when I use them, because I keep those notes so I can share them with you guys. But it's handy anyway, because if you end up with a color palette you really like, you know what colors you used and you can use it in future pieces. So now I'm using some Post-it note tape. You could also use washi tape for this, and I'm using this to create a white border around the piece. Now I like the Post-it note tape because it's a little thicker than washi tape, and it's not as prone to tearing the paper when I remove it. So it's a little bit easier for me to use, but it can be kind of expensive. And I'm going to apply this tape on all 4 colors, and we're starting with the background. So I wanted to use pinks and purples as the main body of the background, and I'm using a technique I've used in a few other tutorials for just kind of a generic misty background. The colors I'm using for this are PB208, PB52, PB280, RV23, 005, which is a Blick Studio Brush color, RV93, and RV63. And in the description, I'm going to designate which colors are Blick, which are Prismacolor, and which are Copic. And basically, I'm just kind of mixing them up, blending them all together, and I'm going to do 2 layers of this to really get more mottled colors. Now, this can be a little bit boring to do. It's a good activity to just kind of zone out with, but it's an easy way to get a background, and you can kind of vary how your background looks by either doing larger sections in a single color or not having so much variance in your color, or sometimes throwing in a contrasting color like a teal here and there could be really cute. You can also use this technique to kind of do like leopard spots or zebra spots or even giraffe spots. It really kind of just depends on what you're looking for. I didn't want the background to be all one color. That will A, eat up your markers pretty fast, and B, it gets just real monotonous to color, and C, it's not as fun as having a multicolor background like this. So I picked several similar colors that would blend well together, but also tied in with the main body of the piece. So once I finished the first layer, I went in with a second layer while it was still kind of wet, and mostly just using light colors, I kind of blended things out so there's not such a harsh transition between the different pinks. Then I spritzed it with 99% isopropyl alcohol that I keep in a spray bottle. This is great for cleanup, and it also works as a solvent with alcohol markers. It kind of pushes the color to the back of the paper, so you can get these really kind of nice, fuzzy, mottled effects. The only problem is it does have a tendency to kind of push your color into other objects. So now I want to use some spray alcohol inks. So first I'm creating a little bit of a protective mask, and I'm just using regular white paper for this, tracing the main character, and I'm just going to tape it down. You can use Frisket. I've just had problems with Frisket, the alcohol inks either seeping under the Frisket or the Frisket tearing the paper or the Frisket leaving residual adhesive on the paper. You can also use washi tape. I've done that in prior tutorials. It wasn't honestly, this is really easy, and I had similar results. The only difference is you don't want to absolutely saturate your paper with this. This is good for just really light spritzing techniques, not where you're trying to cover the whole paper with spritzing. And you could use the Copic airbrush with this, but anybody who watched my Crayola airbrush video knows that I have difficulty getting the Copic airbrush to work. So I'm gonna stick with my alcohol spritzers. And they're really easy to make. If you have alcohol ink, you can use the Copic refill inks, the various inks. You can use Ranger Adirondack inks. You can use Jacquard inks. You can use the Brea Reese inks, basically, or even alcohol inks for resin making. Basically, any alcohol inks will work in this instance. And I'm using teeny tiny little perfume sprayers that I got like 100 of them on Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive. The only problem with this is when I'm spritzing them, they do tend to get all over my hands, but these don't create as much waste as the larger spray bottles can. So I mostly used some reds, some hot pinks. This is a teal. This is Ranger's Patina. It looks like a green, but in reality it's a teal, and that's that contrast color I was telling you guys about. And this ended up spritzing a little more than I wanted to. I ended up covering more of the background than I'd really had planned, but it all worked out in the end. So this is a technique that's great if you're looking for something that's a little bit chaotic, something that's a little less controlled. And you can clean up your desk. So my desk has Teflon sheets on it, and they're just Teflon baking sheets. They're very cheap and they're easy to clean up. So they're great if you're working on a wooden surface and you want to protect it. And you can clean this up very easily by using just that same rubbing alcohol that I showed you guys earlier, because it's a solvent, so you can just wipe it down with that. And then I just need to remove the mask that I've created. And there is a little bit of seepage, but it's not really bad at all. And that's why I did this before I applied any of the color, because as I apply color, that's going to push those colors that kind of seeped in back, and they're going to be way less noticeable. So now the coloring commences. I'm starting with Blick Studio Brush 011, and I'm just applying a little bit of blush to tops of her eyes, her cheeks, inside of her ears, etc. And now I'm using V06, which is a reddish violet color, to start putting in some undershadows. And this is a technique that works really well when I'm rendering darker skin tones. I can establish those darker shadows, those contrast color shadows first, and then I can go over them with the actual skin tones. For the palms of her hands, I used Blick Studio Brush's Camel color, which is like a very light tan color. And now I'm using PB95 as the base skin tone. Now, you know, in post, I kind of wish I'd gone a little bit darker with the shadow on the side of her face that's away from the viewer, but in the end, I'm still really happy with how this illustration turned out. Now with alcohol markers on thirstier papers, and we are working on Strathmore 300 series Bristol paper for this today, which is a thirstier paper. You can get at least 2 layers of color from each marker, so reuse your colors over and over. Once I did a second layer with PB95, I've moved on to my next darkest color, PB65, to start establishing in some shadows. And I also applied 006 to her glasses and that cerulean blue from Prismacolor that I mentioned. Now I want this to actually look like glass, so I'm using a streak effect when I'm applying my next color, PB280, to her glasses. And now I'm going in with PB213, which is our next darkest brown, to start adding in more shadows and building up her skin tone. I went in with PB56 to start adding in some shadows to her glasses and some more streaks to her glasses, and then blended that out a little bit with PB280. So her hair, like I said earlier, is going to be a really light pink all the way to dark purple. So I started with PB208 and blended in some 006. I also want the back bun and her little heart-shaped buns to be a little bit darker than the front bun, so we can start creating some volume, we can start creating some depth in this piece. And basically, when I'm blending hair, I actually have a tutorial here on the channel where I talk to you guys about blending rainbow ombre hair. So a lot of the techniques that I talk about in that tutorial, where we have a base color and we're just going color to color and blending back and forth and taking our time. And it doesn't always turn out the way we envisioned it in our head, but as long as it looks good and as long as it fits the piece, that's good enough. We're not working with digital. We don't have to aim for perfection. We just have to aim for what looks good to us and what actually seems to work. So I'm using PB208 and 006 for a lot of the base color for the hair. And this is one of the reasons I really love brush tips on alcohol markers, is I can get those really nice soft highlights in the hair just by flicking the brush. It's also way easier and way more comfortable for me to color larger areas on a piece It's not as taxing on my hand as, you know, a teeny tiny little bullet nib, scritchy, scritchy, scritchy. You can also oversaturate the area by holding the brush tip down or pressing it down, and that's going to help with the blending. So for her hair, I went from PB 208 to 006, and I went from 006 to PB 52, which is a darker, more purple pink. And then I went from PB 52 to PB 53, and we just blend back and forth to kind of lighten up that transition so it's not so noticeable. And I ended up bringing more of that darker purple by her face. That hadn't been my initial intention, as I mentioned, but in order to get a really nice blend, I ended up working some areas a little bit more than I planned on. But in the end, I'm happy with how the piece turned out, so it doesn't really matter. And then blending back again with the PB 52. Now this does darken the initial lighter colors, but it also lightens the darker colors. So it's a good way to kind of soften that transition. Another layer of PB 53, because like I said, with these thirstier papers, you can get multiple layers of the same color, which means you don't necessarily have to have as many colors in your collection because you're able to build up that tone. Then I'm going in with PB 128, which is kind of a mid purple, but layered on top of this red violet, we get more of a darker red violet color. And then I'm going in with my darkest purple and blending that back out. So PB 51. And this is one of the reasons I'm not necessarily brand loyal, is different brands really excel with different colors. Different brands have different features. And Prismacolor has some really good purples and red violets that I kind of feel like Copic is a little weak in. They also have some great teals and some really nice yellows that, again, I feel like Copic's kind of weak in. Now, I am a big fan of Blick Studio brush markers. I have quite a few of them mixed into my collection, and they've added a bunch of new colors, so I recently ordered those. I can't wait till they come in so I can show them to you guys. But if you're interested in getting started with alcohol markers, the Blick Studio brush markers are one of my favorites. They're refillable, they have replaceable nibs, they're available in a wide array of colors, and they handle a lot like Copic markers. So they're also like half the price of Copics and Prismacolors. So I highly recommend them if you're just starting a collection. I also recommend Copic Chow markers if you're just starting a collection because they're about half the price of a Copic sketch. The only downside is they do come in a smaller selection of colors and they're much harder to find than Copic sketches. Many brick and mortar art supply stores will carry Copic sketches, but don't carry Copic chows. So for the bows in her hair, I started with PB 128, and then I added in shadows using PB 51. So for her dress, I'm going to use a lot of the same really light pinks that I used to start her hair. So I'm starting with PB 208, and I'm going to add in some shadows using 006 a little bit later. But I'm going to get a couple of layers with our PB 208. At this point, I'm just doing a fill of color on the dress. I wanted a really light pink to just kind of contrast with some of the darker pinks and reds that I'm going to use a little bit later on in this illustration. So now I'm using the Blick Studio Brush 006, which I think is like rose petal pink or something like that, to start establishing some of the shadows, and I'm blending that back out with PB 208. And I really love how these three brands, Copic, Prismacolor, and Blick, all play well together. I'm using longer strokes to start knocking in some of the folds on the dress, while still leaving a fair amount of highlight. So with the dress, it's conical in shape, even though it has these, not pleats, but I guess folds in it. And each of those folds are kind of conical in shape too. So I'm keeping that in mind when I'm rendering the folds in the dress. So initially for her stockings, I thought they'd be white stockings with red hearts. So I blocked them in using B00 and a little bit of Prismacolor's Cerulean Blue. But as you guys will see a little later on in this piece, I changed my mind and decided to alter it to be skin tone for the tops of the stockings. So another cool thing about alcohol markers is that you can change your mind and you can kind of relayer things. So to add in some darker shadows on her dress, I'm using PB280, which is a hot pink. And you gotta be kind of careful when you blend this color out because it can start getting more fluoro than you want. Now in this illustration, fluorescent isn't really a problem other than the camera has a lot of trouble with it and my scanner has a lot of trouble with it, but in the original, it wouldn't be an issue. To add in more shadows, I switched over to PB52, which is a more purple pink, and I could have done an even darker layer of that. So to render the white on pretty much everything from her bracelet to her diamond to the lace on her dress, I'm using B00 and Prismacolor Cerulean Blue. And I'm using that on her stockings as well. But like I told you guys, I did change your mind with that. So for the flowers, I'm using Bice Green to start the leaves, and this is a yellow green. I think it's like YG01, but I'm probably wrong with that. And then I'm going to start adding in more shadows using BG13. And then for my final shadows on the leaves, I'm going to use BG03. And what I'm doing is I'm utilizing optical blending. So we have colors that are not really green, but when you layer them together, you get a really nice fresh green. And this is something that kind of comes from my watercolor roots because I love optical blending when we have like bismuth yellow and phthalo blue or bismuth yellow and ultramarine. You can get some really fresh colors. So that's something that I wanted to bring in here. And while I did layer them, I'm not trying to blend out the colors too much with the stems and the leaves on the roses. So for the roses, I figured I'd start kind of losing myself if I just went straight in and colored them dark red. So I'm rendering in some of the shadows first, and this is going to make it easier for me to render the different roses in the bouquet later on. So I'm starting with PB51, and I'm mostly just knocking in all the shadows. So the areas underneath the petals, the center of the flowers, any areas that were left kind of open in the bouquet, I'm filling that in with PB51. And once I've got those shadows established, I'm just doing a fill with PB151, which is a really dark, I believe it's called raspberry. So it's a really dark kind of purplish red. So I'm going to let that color dry a little bit, and I'm going in and adding some darker shadows to her skin, particularly above her eyes, like her eye sockets and where her hair is overlapping her face and where the bouquet is overlapping her hands. And then I went in again for a second layer of PB151 on the bouquet. And I used the same technique of applying a dark purple to kind of create our shadows on the red ribbon. And I'm also going to use that technique on the red part of her stockings. Then I went in with PB 151, leaving a slight highlight on the ribbon that's closer to the viewer and, not as behind the bouquet. For the hearts on her dress, I started with PB 128. Now see, while I was coloring this, I wasn't sure if I was going to do red hearts or if I was going to do purple hearts. So as you can see, I kind of filled in more of the illustration and then decided which I was going to do. And I kind of limited the colors on this because I just have a tendency of having no color theory whatsoever and throw all the colors at a piece. So I find that it's helpful for me to pick 3 main colors and just kind of work with that and just use them over and over again. And to add shadows to the hearts, I then used PB51. So for this illustration, you actually don't need that many colors. And while I'm sharing the colors that I'm using for this illustration, you guys are free to use whatever colors you want to use. To add in the darker red shadows on the roses, I'm using PB150, which is an even darker, even cooler red. I also decided that since the roses were so dark, I needed to add a bit more shadow to the leaves, so I used BG03, which is a dark teal or a dark aqua, to add in more shadows. For the final layer of shadows on the roses, I went in with V99, which is like aubergine, and I really like this color as a shadow color for dark browns, as a shadow color for dark reds, and sometimes even as a shadow color for purples, although neither Prismacolor nor Copic makes a really good super dark purple that trends towards blue, at least not that I've found. So the base colors on the girl are colored in. Now I'm gonna work on the chocolates, and I'm starting with the smallest part. I'm starting with like the nonpareils. Now I wanted 3 types of chocolate here. I wanted a really light milk chocolate, a medium dark chocolate, and then a dark chocolate. So I am starting with PB95 and coloring in a base color on the lighter chocolates. I then went in with that same PB95 and added a second layer, but I'm not covering it all entirely. I am leaving a bit of a rim highlight of the initial color, because like I mentioned, you can get about 3 layers of tone out of every marker. To add in more shadow, I moved on to my next darker color, our next darkest color, PB65, and I'm really trying to keep in mind the forms that I'm rendering. So we have cube chocolates, we have spherical chocolates, and we have conical shaped chocolates. I'm also using PB65 to start rendering in our next darker chocolates, and I'm going to basically use the same technique that I used with the lighter chocolates, where I do 2 layers of this color and then I move on to my next darkest color. And to render in the darker shadows on my middle range chocolates, I'm using PB213. But I found that it was a little darker than I expected here, so I'm blending it back out with PB65. And I went in and did another layer, I guess a 3rd layer with PB65, just so that we can really build up that tone and it's not such a harsh transition between the 2 dark browns. When I built up the tone a little bit more, I then went in with PB213 to start rendering in some of the darker shadows on our middle range chocolates. For our darkest chocolates, I'm starting with PB 213. I'm going to do 2 layers of PB 213, and then I'm going to go into my darkest color, which is E49. Now keep in mind, I still have V99 that I can use to do really dark shadows. So now we're on to our second layer, and I gotta tell you guys, coloring food is so fun for me, especially chocolates. I love drawing, coloring, and painting chocolates almost as much as I like eating them. I just really enjoy drawing food and flowers. If that could be my whole brand, I would be so happy. Cause right? You gotta have some reference, huh? And of course, I'm at the stage where I'm just kind of going in and finessing things, adding a second layer of certain colors here and there, blending some colors out. I'm also using PB213 and E49 to start rendering in like the dark chocolate swirls on some of the chocolates, as well as some of the darker shadows on our dark chocolates. Wow, if I could say chocolate one more time, chocolate. Blah. Now it turns to mush. So we are just about done with the alcohol markers. I'm adding in some white accents using a Derwent white Inktense. You can use a white color pencil for this as well. What's nice about Inktense is if you put too much, you can apply some water and kind of wash it out. And I'm using it to apply just some white highlights to the roses specifically because they did tend to get a little bit lost. There wasn't enough value in, or rather difference in value, difference in intensity, difference in contrast within the roses, and they kind of just became a mass. So I'm putting in some highlights to kind of help with that. And I'm also using some white gouache just to add some highlights here and there to her hair, to her ears, to her eyes, etc. And particularly to the chocolates. So at this point, I feel like I'm basically done. I can go ahead and remove that post-it tape that I'd used to kind of mask off the edges. And I really love this part, and I love this part with watercolors too, because that's when you can see where you started, the white of the paper or the base color of the paper versus how much color and how much work you put into the piece. I just love it. I'm gonna clean those edges up just a little bit. I'm not really a perfectionist about having like perfectly clean lines, but when you're so close to having perfectly clean lines, you might as well go the extra mile. And the whole time I'm thinking to myself, like, what other changes do I want to make? So this is when I decided, I thought the white on the stockings looked weird, so I went ahead and made it her skin tone and basically made them thigh highs. And here's where I'm an awful person, because off camera, I went and made a really cute pattern on her stockings, and I didn't tell you how I did it, but I basically just used dots to add, or used white gouache to add like a scallop or an eyelet lace pattern to her stockings. Now, I slept on it, I came back to it, and I was like, I wanna add a white border around her just to kind of pop her off of those chocolates, because it just started looking kind of flat. And while adding a white border does in a way flatten it out, because it basically makes it look like she's cut out of the paper, it's gonna help differentiate her from the background so she won't kind of merge in with the background as much. I also decided to go back in and tighten up some of the lines that, and kind of change some of the colors or re-ink them. This is going to help kind of readjust your contrast if you lost some of the definition, if you lost some of your line art, if you lost some of the contrast, or if you changed your mind about some of the colors you were using. This is a great way to kind of fix that. You can always ink again after. So I want to also say I had a migraine while I was working on this piece, especially towards the end here, so my hands are a little shaky and I'm not able to pull lines as cleanly as I would have liked. But I'm really happy with how this piece turned out. She turned out so cute. It's kind of a shame I wasn't able to finish her in time for Valentine's Day, but I did create some 7-inch Cara Valentines to share, so I don't feel that bad. But I'm absolutely delighted with how cute she turned out. This is the reason I love working with alcohol markers. You can get some really beautiful, vibrant colors, and you're not waiting for paint to dry. So you know, in terms of recording time, I do actually spend a little bit longer when I'm working with alcohol markers, but when I'm working with watercolor, there's so much time where I'm pausing the camera and I'm just letting paint dry and I'm not working on anything else. So alcohol markers are a great medium for artists who love color, who love bright saturation, and who enjoy working with traditional media. I still love traditional media. I love the immediacy of it. I love being able to create something in real time on physical paper that I can look at. Does it make it less or more than digital art? Absolutely not. It's just different. And different artists work with the media they work with because it has qualities that they love and they enjoy. But if I can encourage you guys to give alcohol markers a shot if you haven't yet, or to try them again if you didn't like them in the past, please try them out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had so much fun rendering this piece. If you liked it, leave me a thumbs up and leave me a comment. I'm open to suggestions. I'm interested in what you guys want to see here on the channel. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I love you guys. I hope you guys are safe and happy. And I hope this video was helpful, useful, and informative for y'all. If you did enjoy it, please consider joining me and subscribing to the channel.